Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Easter has many different associations, from religion to chocolate. But for the Australian constitutional lawyer, one's mind does tend to turn to the Queensland Government's steamship, the Lucinda, and its trip on the Hawkesbury River, where significant work was done on the first draft of the Commonwealth Constitution over the Easter break in 1891. Now, I'll come back to that history shortly, but first, let me give you an opportunity to board the Lucinda and argue with Samuel Griffith, Edmund Barton and the others about what should be included in the Constitution. A relative of mine was recently explaining to me a computer game that he had designed. It's a literary choose-your-own-adventure game. It's totally text-based, and it uses the vast knowledge held by AI in order to transport your character into whatever literary, fantasy or historical world you choose. You get to decide how you want the AI to respond, what style of language it uses, what degree of challenges it throws up to you, etc. You can be a superhero, a wizard, a starship captain, or a heroine from a Jane Austen novel, whatever you choose. Now, as you've probably imagined, I'm not really into playing computer games. But on hearing about this, a brilliant thought came to my mind. The AI, which in this case is the rather sophisticated Claude, would have full access to everything that had been said in the Constitutional Convention debates in the 1890s, because it's all online, not to mention biographical accounts of the various framers of the Constitution. Could you then use this game to put yourself back in the 1890s and to debate constitutional issues with the framers of the Constitution and perhaps convince them to change the draft Constitution? Well, yes, you can. So I wrote 3 prompts for this game, which set out the scenarios that you can play. One, called Mischief on the Lucinda, has you playing as Sir George Grey, who was previously the Governor-General and indeed the Prime Minister of New Zealand and a great pot stirrer. In real life, he attended the 1891 Constitutional Convention and he argued for the Governor-General to be elected by the people. In this game, I have him barging his way onto the Lucinda, uninvited, for this Easter constitutional drafting party. His aim is to cause trouble, both about New Zealand's admission to this proposed federation and about electing the Governor-General. Now that's the starting point. AI then sets the scene and lets you start the stoush. In another game, you can play as Andrew Inglis Clark. Now, he was a supporter of the US Bill of Rights and he did manage to get an equal protection clause included in the 1891 draft of the Constitution. But he didn't stand for election to the 1897 Constitutional Convention. Now, in this game, you, as Clark, realise that your equal protection clause is at risk, and so you race to Melbourne during the 1898 session of the convention to hold a secret meeting with Barton, Isaacs, Kingston and O'Connor, who all have quite different views on these rights. You argue not only to preserve the Equal Protection Clause, but also to extend it to provide a due process guarantee and citizenship rights. Will you sway the doubters? Well, that's up to you. In the third game, you're Catherine Helen Spence. You ran for election to the Constitutional Convention of 1897 and in this alternative world, you won. So you're the only female member of this Constitutional Convention and you want to convince the drafting committee to guarantee the rights of women to vote and also to impose the voting system of proportional representation that you have designed. You step into the gentlemen's smoking room in the Adelaide Parliament where the committee is huddled and you try to manipulate them into achieving your aims. Now, when I played this, I actually did quite well as Catherine Helen Spence, managing to secure voting rights for women, but it did take a bit of effort. The AI resets every time that you play the game, so even if you use the same prompts, the game turns out differently. Now, I've saved those 3 constitutional prompts in the Saved Games section, but you can, of course, design any scenario that you want. You could just as easily debate with Alexander Hamilton and James Madison about what you think should be included in the US Constitution. Think they made a mistake? Maybe want to revisit executive power? Well, you could make yourself a time traveller back to 1787. How would you convince the framers of the Constitution that you came from the 21st century, and what would you tell them about how the Constitution has actually worked in practice in the meantime? What would you warn them about, and what would you ask them to change? Now, you can play any of these games on litplay.net, and I'll put a link in the box below to that. You can save your prompt and make it publicly available for others to look at too if you want, or you can just keep it private. You can come for the constitutional argy-bargy and then stay to be a superhero in your own adventure fantasy story. So there's fun for the whole family over Easter. Now, there's a free trial, and then you can subscribe if you enjoy it. It's best done on a computer rather than a mobile phone because it is text-based. To be clear, this is not a paid ad, but I did suggest the constitutional use for this game because, let's face it, I'm rather odd. And I did write those prompts because I thought there is a small niche of people in the world who actually would like to go back and enjoy that challenge of arguing these constitutional issues with the framers of the relevant constitution. The answers, of course, are given by AI, not me. I'm not in a little box in the computer frantically typing the constitutional responses. The AI can always be wrong, but it does have a vast knowledge base and it is increasingly growing more sophisticated. You can also challenge its answers if you think they're wrong and ask it to justify them. You can instruct it to draw from particular sources like the convention debates and to be historically accurate. Personally, I would have found this fantastic when I was teaching. It's just a terrific way of immersing students in anything from constitution making to a novel or a period of history by getting them to play an active role and create an alternative history. And it's all text-based as well, which is great for both literacy and for marking. The game's still in its testing stage, so there may be some glitches, particularly if a whole lot of people will decide to do it together at the same time. But if you do play it and enjoy it, do let others know, and do also save any interesting prompts that others might like to use to play with. Now, getting back to real history, what actually happened on the Lucinda? Back in 1890, the colonies agreed to pursue the idea of federation and hold a national constitutional convention to draft a constitution. Before the convention sat, Andrew Inglis Clark from Tasmania and Charles Kingston from South Australia circulated their own draft constitutions, drawing on constitutional provisions from the United States Constitution, Canada's Constitution, and of course the constitutions of the Australian colonies. The 1891 Constitutional Convention began by debating general principles and resolutions which set out the basic outline for the Constitution. Committees were also established to consider different aspects of the Constitution, like the judiciary. The most important committee, however, was the Constitution Committee, and the key one was its subcommittee, the Drafting Committee. Now, this was comprised of the Queensland Premier, Sir Samuel Griffith, later the first Chief Justice of the High Court, along with Charles Kingston and Andrew Inglis Clark, who you've already heard of. Now, they quickly assembled a draft constitution which gave effect to the work of the committees and the resolutions of the convention, and in doing so, they understandably also drew on the earlier drafts that Clark and Kingston had prepared and the work that Griffith had done on both the establishment of the Federal Council of Australasia back in 1885 and a proposal to federate Queensland into 3 separate provinces in 1890, which never went ahead. Once the preliminary draft was printed, Griffith then invited a select group of lawyers from the convention to join him on a drafting party over the Easter break in 1891. On Good Friday, they left the distractions of Sydney behind and headed out on the Queensland Government's paddle steamer, the Lucinda, which was named after the American wife of the Governor of Queensland. The Lucinda had been described in the press as one of the most magnificent, upholstered and effectively equipped steamers afloat. On board were Griffith and Kingston. Clark, however, was struck down by the flu and he was replaced at the last minute by Edmund Barton. Barton had a reputation for being lazy, but having been given this great opportunity, he worked prodigiously with Griffith and Kingston, slaving over drafting issues from 10 in the morning till 11 at night. Also on board were Henry Rickson from Victoria, Sir John Downer from South Australia, Andrew Tyne from Queensland, and a non-delegate, Bernard Wise from New South Wales. The Lucinda headed north along the coast, but it was hit by a very large swell and a number of the passengers were quite seasick. Now, this might have been why Rickson and later Downer left the party early, preferring to return to Sydney by land. The Lucinda reached Broken Bay and cruised the Hawkesbury River, anchoring at Refuge Bay. Griffith reported that there was a waterfall in the bush which provided a natural shower, but he had decided not to use it himself. The others, however, seemed to find it a most refreshing break. Most of the work seems to have been done in the smoking room of the Lucinda, of which this is a recreation. You can see Griffith's handwritten annotations done on the Lucinda in John Williams' collection of drafts, The Australian Constitution, A Documentary History. And as you can see, there were a lot of annotations made during that time. Now, it's quite hard to get a copy of this book, but as I've mentioned before, there is a project underway to make all the constitutional drafts available online. So more on that once it is live. On Easter Sunday, the Lucinda headed back to Sydney to pick up Clark, who had somewhat recovered from the flu. They then proceeded to Middle Harbour, where Griffith, Clark, Kingston and Barton settled a full draft of the Constitution. One of the provisions that Clark managed to get included on that Easter Sunday said, "A state shall not make or enforce any law abridging any privilege or immunity of citizens of other states of the Commonwealth, nor shall a state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." That provision was included in the final 1891 draft of the Constitution, but as I foreshadowed in my game prompt earlier, it was lost in 1898, partly because Clark wasn't there to defend it, and the delegate who was trying to defend it on Clark's behalf lost Clark's explanatory memorandum and couldn't explain it properly. Such are the quirks of history. For those who are interested in reading about the history of the drafting of the Constitution, the book by J.A. Lenoz on the making of the Australian Constitution is a really useful source. Again, you'd have to get it from a library or maybe from a second-hand bookstore. For those who'd like to see a bit of the Lucinda on an Easter weekend excursion, you are in luck if you are in Brisbane. There's a recreation of the smoking room of the Lucinda at the Queensland Maritime Museum, which I visited a couple of years ago, and I rather hope it's still there. They also have a model of the ship, the real wheel of the ship, its cutlery, and a couple of its chairs with the Lucinda written on it. The bar from the Lucinda was taken out and fittingly was placed in the Queensland Parliament in the Lucinda room. Unfortunately, the table on which the Commonwealth Constitution was drafted was allegedly sold to a pub for £1 and later chopped up for firewood. But at least we have the odd chair and spoon from those days and, of course, a computer game that can send you back in time there. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. My Easter greetings to you all, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.